Savvy. Perfect. We're recording. Excellent. I know we have, hi Clay. Let me just check. I know we have a number of people that want to be here. So let me just make sure. Let's see. We've got 4, 5, 6, 10, 11, 12. Yeah, we've got to just give everyone a couple minutes to join on. And I know we're going to have at least a dozen people that wanted to be here.
Shut my door.
Let me just see here. Okay. Oh yeah, perfect. September 11th, huh?
Yeah.
Right there. Sure is. Okay. I'm just gonna pause again now. All right, and I'm gonna go off screen and take it away, Doug.
All right, thanks. I'm going to give a real brief overview of how groundwater works here in Island County, and then I'm going to talk about what sort of issues we have. What are the problems? What are the issues that we run into, and what do they mean for us? And then if I have time at the end, I'll talk a little bit about what data we have available to us and how you can access that data from out there in the real world. So, Island County sits in something known as the what's it called? Puget Sound Basin, sorry, brief memory loss, which is a deep depression in the bedrock surface. Bedrock outcrops up in the Olympics, it outcrops over in the Cascades, and it actually outcrops up near Deception Pass, but in between, the bedrock forms a deep basin or a bowl. And it's about 4,000 feet to bedrock in the center of the county. Everything above that's unconsolidated sands and gravels, silts and clays and such. Some definitions. Groundwater is water that exists in subsurface geologic formations. There are two zones underground. There's the saturated zone where all of the void space or open space between the rock or the sediment is filled with water, and the unsaturated zone where portions of the void space are filled with water and portions are filled with air. An aquifer is a saturated geologic formation that can produce, quote, usable quantities of water. What is a usable quantity? Well, here in Island County, we tend to think about 1 gallon a minute is the minimum you'd want to feel real comfortable about supplying an individual home. In the Middle East, they probably think something significantly less than that is usable just because of the scarcity of water. An aquifer can be composed of unconsolidated sands and gravels or consolidated bedrock formations such as sandstones, limestones, and fractured igneous and metamorphic rocks. Here in Island County, virtually all of our aquifers are composed of unconsolidated sands and gravels saturated with water. Another term that we use is called an aquitard. An aquitard is a less permeable geologic formation. It's not that they don't pass water, they pass it, but at a lower rate, not particularly usable for production. So if you were to complete a well in a silt, you could come back in an hour or two and there'd be a column of water you could pump off, and come back an hour later and there'd be a column of water. If you were to complete a well in a clay, you could come back a couple weeks later and there'd be a column of water there that you could pump off, and a couple weeks after that it'd be there again. So a real fundamental function of our system is something known as the hydrologic cycle. We have moisture-laden air coming in off the Pacific, dropping water down via precipitation onto land surface. Some of it runs off to fill up our lakes and streams, and some of it infiltrates down into the ground to recharge our aquifer systems. You have evaporation off the water surfaces, transpiration from plants back up, and that round and round process is called the hydrologic cycle. It's extremely important for us here in Island County because essentially what it does is it acts as a very large-scale solar-powered desalination system. The sun evaporates water off of the Pacific Ocean, creating the clouds that create the rain here in Island County, that takes salt water and creates fresh water for us that then recharges our aquifer systems. So what are some of the risks or concerns we have here in Island County regarding groundwater? Probably the most important one, or the most forward one in our minds, is seawater intrusion. And I will talk about that now, but first I'm going to list all the rest of them. Arsenic is a common problem for us here, and nitrates are an issue that we run into. And then there are a host of other contaminants, and I'll touch briefly on those. Also, the potential for dewatering is an issue in some areas and some aquifers. And sea level rise is the final one that I'm going to be talking about today. But we're going to start with seawater intrusion. And we'll go back to some more definitions. When you have a scenario such as we do, where this is an island, here's Puget Sound, where your aquifers abut up against a marine water body such as Puget Sound, portions of the aquifer end up occupied by salt water, and portions of the aquifer are occupied by fresh water. We use chloride concentration. Sodium chloride is the primary salt in seawater. We use chloride concentrations as an indicator of saltiness. And out in the open ocean, chloride concentrations are up to 18,000 milligrams per liter. In the saline portions of groundwater systems, they can be up to 18,000 milligrams per liter. And in fresh groundwater, we typically see chloride concentrations down around 20 or 40 milligrams per liter. So not zero, but nowhere near the concentrations we see in Puget Sound. The interface between the freshwater zone and the saltwater zone is known as the freshwater seawater interface. And there's a relationship. So this is sea level here. There's a relationship between how high water levels in an aquifer rise above sea level, and I'm trying to hide that little bar, there we go, and the thickness of the freshwater lens below sea level. And that relationship runs about 40 to 1. It's for every foot of freshwater pressure we have above sea level, we have about 40 feet of freshwater lens thickness below sea level. And let me put that back. And that relationship's known as the Geibben-Herzberg relation, after the scientists back in the 1800s that discovered it. So now if we were to pump a well in this situation, the first thing that occurs is something known as drawdown, where water levels in the immediate vicinity of the well are lowered in a cone shape. It creates what's known as a drawdown cone. And in response to that lowering of pressure, water flows to the well to replenish the water that's being pumped out. If there is seawater somewhere down below the bottom of that well when it's pumping, then that seawater will start to rise up in a mirror image of that drawdown cone. That is known as upconing. And upconing is one form of saltwater intrusion. Saltwater intrusion is the invasion of fresh surface or groundwater by saltwater. If you know the source of the water is from the ocean or marine water, it's called seawater intrusion. So upconing is one form of seawater intrusion. The other form of seawater intrusion is known as lateral intrusion. That's where the entire interface moves inward and upward in responses to lowering of the pressure in this aquifer, lowering of these water levels above sea level. So in reality, that interface between the freshwater zone and the saltwater zone is not a sharp line. Instead, you end up with something known as a zone of diffusion or zone of mixing, where you have freshwater here, and as you move across, you get gradually saltier and saltier. So now if we were to put a well in and begin pumping and we have upconing occur, if the upconing begins to reach the well, your chlorides don't suddenly go from 20 milligrams per liter to 18,000 milligrams per liter. Instead, they go from 20 to 40 to 80 to 100 and so on, as you begin to capture just the very inside edge of this interface. So there are some geochemical forces acting on that interface known as diffusion and dispersion, and they cause that interface to always be moving into the freshwater zone. So there's always, the saltwater is always trying to move into the freshwater zone. Without something to counteract that, our aquifers would become saline in a relatively short amount of time. Well, what do we have that counteracts that? We have precipitation landing on land surface, some of which runs off, some of it percolates down to recharge our aquifer system. That recharge sets up a flow in the aquifer. And in an island scenario, it's almost always downward at the center of the islands and then outward towards the shorelines, eventually discharging along the shorelines. Well, that flow also sweeps the inside edge of this interface along with it. So you end up with not only fresh water discharging along the shoreline, but some slightly salty or brackish water also discharging along the shoreline. So if you imagine this whole thing in motion, you've got constant recharge, constant flow. The interface is always moving inward, but is also continuously being swept off towards the shoreline by the freshwater flow. And if nothing changes, this is a dynamic equilibrium. Everything's moving, but this interface essentially stays where it is. It doesn't move beyond the continuous motion. So this is the pre-development or equilibrium condition. What we do can and does change the system. What sort of changes do we do? Well, one thing we do is we come in and we put in developments. We put in roads, we put in houses, we put in impervious surfaces. And at least in days gone by, most of the runoff that was generated from these impervious surfaces was routed to storm drains and piped off to Puget Sound. Well, that reduces groundwater recharge. That reduction in recharge reduces the water level slope needed to move the water through the system, which means you've lowered these water levels, which means the interface is going to move inward. Another thing that happens is droughts. I've been here about 25 years, and in that time, there's been a few droughts in Western Washington. And if they're bad enough, I sometimes get calls from the press asking, well, what does that mean for Island County? And by and large, I say it doesn't mean much. And that's because the amount of time it takes for a raindrop hit land surface, percolate down through all of these overlying layers and reach our regional aquifers is on the order of tens, if not more, years. So during those 10 or 20 or 40, 50 years, there'll be some drier than average years, there'll be some wetter than average years, and it all tends to average out. So we are somewhat buffered from the droughts that definitely affect the rest of Western Washington, where they're relying on snowmelt in the mountains to recharge their rivers during the late summers. And if there isn't enough snow up there during any given year, they get in real trouble. Groundwater withdrawals. So whenever we pull water out of the aquifer, that's reducing the amount of flow towards the shoreline, which has the same effect as pavement in that it reduces this gradient, which reduces the height above sea level and reduces the freshwater lens thickness. So in summary, the saltwater freshwater interface has always been there, and it's always moved in response to changes in the system, but things we do can and do actually have influence on that interface. So that's, now I'm going to talk real briefly about how does Island County deal with seawater intrusion? Well, back in the early 90s, we created Island County Code 8.09.099, which is Seawater Intrusion Protection. And it's based on a risk rating scheme. So we have a way of rating risk spatially around the county. And the way it works is it's based on water level elevations, the same idea, so that if the elevation in the water table is high enough above sea level, the freshwater lens is thick enough that you don't have risk. And so if water levels are greater than 8.4 feet, and that's on NAVD 88 datum, we consider it to be low risk, and we ignore chlorides because there are areas of the county that have elevated chlorides that are not due to seawater intrusion. And so by basing the first cut of our rating system on water level elevations, it allows us to ignore all of those elevated chlorides that are not thought to be due to seawater intrusion. Once you drop below 8.4 feet on the water level elevation, you're at medium risk. And then depending on your chloride concentration, you may move to high or very high. So if you are less than 8.4 and chloride's in the area, are less than 100 milligrams per liter, you're at medium risk. If your chlorides are between 100 and 200, you're at high risk. And if chlorides are greater than 250, I'm sorry, between 100 and 250, and if they're greater than 250, you're at very high risk. And these are all based on all of the data we have in our system. If you look at any given point in the county, we draw a half-mile circle around that point that we're evaluating. The first thing we look for are there low water level elevations in the area, in which case you bounce to medium risk, and then we look to see if there's elevated chlorides, in which case you could bounce to high or very high. So that's the half-mile radius is combining both the low water level elevations and high chloride wells. So what does this do to us? Well, if you're in low risk, then it doesn't do anything. We don't review land subdivisions, we don't review expanding or newer expanding water systems, and we don't review individual wells. Once you move to medium risk, this is where you have low water levels, but at this point we don't have elevated chlorides. Then the thinking is only kind of bigger projects could result in causing seawater intrusion. So we only look for more than 6 lot subdivisions, adding or creating of a water system of more than 6 connections. And once again, we still don't look at individual wells. Once you hit high risk, that's low water level elevations and chlorides between 100 and 250. We look at any land subdivision, we look at creation or of more than one connection on a water system, and we look at individual wells on really small parcels, less than 1.5 acres in size. Once you hit very high risk, this is where chlorides are greater than 250, water is beginning to taste salty. We look at any land subdivision, any expansion or creation of a water system, and individual wells on less than 5 acres. If you are a public water system and you have sources, wells, that are classified as elevated risk, medium, high, or very high, you're required to sample for chloride and conductivity in April and August of every year. And that's our way of kind of keeping our finger on the pulse in these elevated risk areas. The public water systems are much more likely to be the first to intrude because they pull a lot more water out of the ground. So by keeping an eye on those public water system sources in the areas of elevated risk, we can feel confident that we're keeping an eye on whether intrusion problems are getting worse or not. And then any of these projects that are subject to review, that means that we are going to require the applicant to provide analysis, testing and analysis by which we will evaluate whether their project will cause or make seawater intrusion problems worse. And if they can't show that they can do it without making things worse, they will be denied. And that's about all I need to talk about there. So that was seawater intrusion. Does anybody have questions about that before we move on?
A real quick question, Doug. What percentage of the island would you say is high or very high?
I would guess probably, I haven't ever really done that calculation, but looking at a map, I would guess something on the order of 5 or 10%, probably closer to 5%.
Okay, is Camino worse?
It is, only because it has more long, thin areas that are the most prone, like the panhandle of Camino and the northeast corner of Camino are kind of peninsula-like, and those are problematic from a seawater intrusion perspective.
As far as seawater intrusion, is it always areas that are narrow where the wells are close to the beach?
Almost always, because what happens when you have a narrow area, if you look from the center of the island to the shoreline and it's not a very long distance, then there's not much area for recharge to occur. And if there's not much recharge occurring, there's not much flow in that aquifer. If there's not much flow in the aquifer, then you don't have to build up much pressure to get the water moving through, and you end up with a very thin freshwater lens. And virtually every area where we have intrusion, that is the case. You're looking at narrow portions of the island with small amounts of recharge and not much flow.
And one last question. Fidalgo Island seems like it's a giant rock compared to Whidbey Island. Everywhere I look on Fidalgo Island, I just see the rocks outcropping everywhere.
Right.
Do they have saltwater intrusion issues?
Yes, and in fact, much of the San Juans is similar, has Much of the San Juans are bedrock based, and with bedrock and fracture flow in particular, it's a tougher situation. There's much less water available in a bedrock, a fractured igneous and metamorphic aquifer than there is in a saturated sand and gravel. So they have much more significant intrusion problems and water source problems in general than we do.
Thank you.
Yep. So that covers seawater intrusion. Now I'm going to talk about arsenic. So arsenic in our situation is naturally occurring, meaning that the source of the arsenic is the bedrock. It's a mineral in the bedrock that the glaciers ground up to create our sand and gravel aquifers. The drinking water standard, the maximum contaminant level set by the US EPA, is 0.01 milligrams per liter, or 10 parts per billion. It used to be they changed the MCL back in the early 90s, and it used to be 0.05 instead of 0.01. And when it was 0.05, almost no wells in the county exceeded the standard. But when they dropped it to the 0.01, almost 20% of our wells exceed the standard. And it seems rather randomly distributed. We have looked at the spatial distribution both vertically with elevation and depth and horizontally across the map. And it's just something of a shotgun blast across the county. So what happens if you drill a new well and you test it and you end up with elevated arsenic? Well, if it's an individual and or two-party well, two-party water system, we require that you post notice to title for the properties that are served by that well. That will simply inform future property owners that the well on the property does not meet drinking water standards. A new Group B is required to treat. Group Bs are regulated by Island County Health Department, and statewide, the State Department of Health's policy is to not allow a new Group B to be created using a source that exceeds any primary MCL, including arsenic. We here in this county have taken on the responsibilities of managing Group Bs and have arranged with the State Department of Health. We have the ability to create a variance on that, and we do. We can't really say that 20% of our wells can't be used. So we have the ability to create a variance, and you must treat, but in the case of Group Bs, point of use filters are acceptable. You could have a little undersink reverse osmosis filter on your connections, and that would be acceptable to us. We don't, because we don't have engineers on staff, we don't review or help design or permit the treatment systems, but we do require that you do create a treatment system. Group A's, which are regulated by the State Department of Health, must treat, and even retroactively. So if you were a Group A and you were in existence prior to the change of the standard, when the standard changed, you were required to treat that water from then on. That was not the case with the Group Bs. We notified them that they had exceedances, but we did not retroactively require treatment for the old Group B systems. Any questions about arsenic?
Can you define Group A, Group B, and
Sure. So the difference between Group A's and Group B's, Group A's are more than 15 connections or more than, I think it's 25 people on the system. So if you're less than that and more than 2 connections, you're a Group B. If you're greater than 15 connections or greater than 25 people, you're a Group A.
Okay, another question. When does a well require a license? If somebody's got some dirt and they want to drill a well, when does it require a license?
So all well drilling requires a permit, and licensed well drillers are the only ones to drill a well, although there is within the State Department of Ecology regulates well drilling, and they do have an allowance for owner-builder well drilling. It sort of frightens me, but it is an allowable thing. But all of it, even if you are an owner driller and you drill your own well, you still have to get permits from the State Department of Ecology to what's called a start card, and then you have to file your water well report with the state. So the same permitting requirements are involved whether you owner drill or you hire a licensed well driller.
And then the last question, when does a well system require a satellite management company as opposed to just the homeowners managing it?
Oh, and this is where I need Annetta to answer that one.
Don't worry about
I think any new group A or B requires that. And I think that retroactively, group A's all require it. I think that the policy here is that with group B's, we encourage them to, and if there's any kind of problems with the management or sampling or compliance of the system, then we push them to. But that's a question that it would be better answered by Annette Hupfauer, who's our Group B water system manager.
Okay, and there's no such thing as a group C?
Nope.
Okay.
I guess that could be a two-party. We're the only, two parties are not common. That's something sort of unique to Island County. I've got a quick question for you guys. Can you see my cursor when I'm moving it around the screen?
Yes.
Oh, good, because I was using that to point at things earlier. I wasn't sure if it showed. Okay, I'm going to move along to nitrates. So nitrates are sourced from fertilizers and or septic systems. And these can be commercial fertilizers on farms or fertilizers used at residential properties and septic systems. The drinking water standard for nitrate is 10 milligrams per liter. It causes methahemoglobemia, which is blue baby syndrome. It affects the ability of babies, infants to absorb oxygen. So that's where they come up with the blue baby syndrome. Here in Island County, we have some hot spots, and by and large, they're almost always related to two or three things. One of them being high density development without sewers, and typically susceptible aquifers. And by susceptible aquifers, I mean aquifers that that have short travel times between land surface and the aquifer. So if you have an aquifer that's relatively shallow, 50 feet-ish down, and it's mostly sand and gravel on the way down, then there's a fairly short travel time between land surface and that aquifer. And so if you have that in combination with high density development and no sewers, that's where we tend to see problems arrive. One example of that is Freeland. Freeland is kind of our poster child for that situation. They have steadily rising nitrate concentrations in Freeland's own well fields and in wells in the same vicinity that are private or small public water system sources. And eventually they're going to need to sewer or do something, because at some point this will get to a point where it's no longer healthy. We're still okay right now. They're still below the MCLs, but it's moving in the wrong direction. We also see sometimes just a well or two in an area, or a well in an area, kind of an outlier. And that typically occurs with well construction. So modern well construction has something known as a well seal. Wells create a vertical pathway through all of those underlying aquitars. So you have all these protective layers overlying your aquifer. Well, when you drill a well, you potentially create a vertical pathway that short circuits past those confining layers. Modern well construction requires what's known as a well seal, where they drill a larger diameter hole than the well they're going to drill. So if they're drilling a 6-inch well, they'll drill a 10 or 12-inch hole for the first 18 feet minimum. And then they go ahead and drill the 6-inch well on down, and then they fill the space between that outer casing and the inner casing with bentonite clay pellets. Then they pull that outer casing and hydrate, which causes that to swell up and create a seal, which prevents vertical migration of superficial contaminants downward. Sometimes we find some wells that have bacteria problems or nitrate problems that are all by themselves, and oftentimes that's a missing, because some of the older wells didn't have them. They weren't required back in the day. Missing well seals or damaged well seals or some other thing like that. Nitrate is, the MCL is a primary MCL, maximum contaminant level. Primary MCLs are health risks. And so all of the same types of regulations that we mentioned with arsenic, as far as notice to title on individual wells, treatment, and all of that sort of thing, the same thing occurs here with nitrates because it is a primary MCL. Secondary MCLs are aesthetic standards, and I will be getting to that in a little bit. And they don't have the same type of regulations. They are taste or smell or color or things like that don't affect health, but affect the potability or the palatability of water. So other contaminants.
Guys, I've got a question about the
Sure.
nitrate.
Sure.
Recently, there was a bit of a controversy about a field. I think there was some septic waste being spread around on a field. I don't know if that was a county decision or not. I don't have all the details in my head. But how does the spreading of septic waste affect the nitrates and going into the water table?
So I assume you're talking about biosolids.
Yes.
And biosolids are generated by sewage treatment plants. They're a byproduct of the sewage treatment plant process. And biosolids applications are regulated by the State Department of Ecology. And they have specific formulas and methodologies by which they can calculate application rates so that it does not create a situation where you end up mobilizing nitrates. Always work? No. And are there risks involved? Yes. But they also have monitoring requirements that go along with it to try and verify that things are going in the proper way. So they're a strongly regulated process, and there are testing requirements that go along with that. So in theory, they should be safe. I am cautious about them, mostly because of the topic I'm about to talk about, which are other contaminants. And when you look at something like biosolids, there's a lot of other things that are in there in the water that could potentially cause problems. And perhaps, and this is a great lead into this discussion of other contaminants, because what we're talking about are things called contaminants of emerging concern. Essentially things that we didn't know about 20 or 40 years ago, but now we do. And that has been going on forever. And so, you know, even if we look at what we know today, the odds are really high that 20 years from now, we're going to find out, oh, there's all sorts of other things we didn't know about back then. We thought we were doing everything right, but we weren't. So some of the contaminants of emerging concern that are currently in this news are pharmaceuticals. And you can test water and find pharmaceuticals in the water, and they are doing it nationwide, and they're finding a lot in the river systems. Personal care products are another one. One of the most common things that they find in testing water that is of anthropogenic origin is caffeine. We find caffeine makes its way through the water systems, treatment plants, and ends up out there. But the one I really want to talk about, because it's one that is concerning to people on Whidbey Island in particular, is PFAS. PFAS are per and polyfluorinated alkyl substances. And it's a whole family of chemicals that have been around since the 50s or 40s or something like that. And they've been used in all sorts of things. Anything that's waterproof, water resistant, stain resistant. So things like anything stain resistant. So your carpets that have stain resistance, or your furniture that has stain resistance. Anything that's waterproof. So your rain jackets and all of those sorts of things all have these chemicals in them, along with something known as AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, which is firefighting foam. It's a heavy component in firefighting foams. It's kind of how they work, is they create a very thin film that goes across petroleum fires, and it essentially smothers the petroleum fires. But it turns out that the problem with PFAS, and there's a couple things that make them really insidious. And the first one is that they last forever. They call them the indestructible chemicals. So they get out in the environment, and unlike other things like petroleum and your solvents and things associated with landfills, most of those eventually biodegrade or oxidize. Eventually they go away. PFAS does not. It does not break down. It does not biodegrade. It just stays around forever. So it's very persistent in the environment, very mobile in the environment. Second thing is it sticks to us. We bioaccumulate it. So if you have water that's at some concentration of PFAS, then your bloodstream will end up with significantly higher concentrations than that, like 100 times more concentrated than what's in the water you're drinking, because it sticks to you. And then it has a lot of different health concerns, and more than I would care to try and list, but just safe to say that it's has a lot of health concerns. So this is one that's very much in the spotlight right now. And it's in the spotlight because the Navy has found it in waters in and around NAS Whidbey installations. And it's because of firefighting foam. And in years gone by, we used to see big black columns of smoke coming up at NAS Whidbey, and that's where they would throw jet fuel all over something, light it on fire, then practice putting it out. And they did that a lot. They had fire training facilities up there. I suspect they still do, but that's probably the major source of it, is just in training they did using these foams over the years. And so in 2016, like I said, these chemicals have been around since the 40s, I think, and heavily used all over the country. In 2016, the US EPA issued what's called a lifetime health advisory for 2 specific PFAS chemicals, PFOA and PFOS, at 70 parts per trillion. Parts per trillion is a really, really small number. We're talking very, very low concentrations. You try and describe to people what is a part per trillion. Well, my favorite saying is it's 6 inches on a trip to the sun. 6 inches on a trip to the sun. So we're talking very, very, very low concentrations. They are investigating and have been investigating ever since 2016 in and around Alt Field and in around OLF, outlying field in Coopville. They found a couple wells up at Alt Field that exceeded the lifetime health advisory level, and they found a handful of wells south of OLF that exceeded the lifetime health advisory level, including the town of Coopville's primary biggest well out at what's called, well, at the OLF well field. So Coopville has wells down in this neck of the woods, and they have a well right up here in the center of the island, right next to OLF, and that well ended up impacted by PFAS. The Navy has since installed a water treatment system at the Fort Casey well field down here, so it's treating the water from all of the Fort Casey wells before it goes in the pipeline to Coopville. And that's a great thing for the town of Coopville, because the type of treatment that's done is using what's called granulated activated carbon. And granulated activated carbon not only removes PFAS from water, but it's also a common polishing step for many types of water treatment. And so it has undoubtedly improved the quality of water that the town is serving, in addition to getting rid of the PFAS. The one other thing I want to say about PFAS is that the US EPA has yet to create an enforceable standard. And there's a fair amount of, let's just say, unrest over that at various states. And so there are now multiple states that are creating their own enforceable standards for PFAS chemicals. And Washington State has a group that is currently evaluating that. And it looks like they probably are going to create their own state regulations in absence of federal regulations. Any questions about that? All right, we will move onward.
Quick question.
Okay.
Let's talk about the landfill in Coopville.
Okay.
Is there a similar concern there of down gradient?
Well, so Coopville landfill, along with Oak Harbor's landfill and the Navy landfill, all have extensive monitoring well systems around them. And in the case of Coopville, there is no treatment currently occurring. When I talked about biodegradation and things, the main contaminant they're finding at the Coopville landfill is vinyl chloride. And vinyl chloride does biodegrade. And then they've done computer modeling on the plume of vinyl chloride at Coupeville, and at this point it has not left the property, and they don't expect it to leave the property because it's grown to a certain length, and then biodegradation starts taking over, and it essentially, these types of plumes grow for a while, then they slow to a halt, and then they begin to shrink. And that's what is expected to happen with the Coupeville plume. At the Navy landfill, which is located right here, if you can see my mouse, there's actually two landfills there. It's the Navy and Oak Harbor landfills. They have significant contamination, and they actually have a pump and treat system that's designed to take out volatile organic hydrocarbons such as vinyl chloride and a few other things. And that's been in operation for a number of years. And the way that it works is the groundwater flow is generally to the south or southeast in this area. And so they have a line of extraction wells that then pull water out of the ground and throw it through the treatment system, and then they re-infiltrate it on the north side of the landfill. The types of treatment that they are doing has zero effect on PFAS. And so essentially the PFAS has just been running through the system and going right back down on the ground. And they have actually had some detections of PFAS off base this neck of woods, a few different homes and I think a trailer park. And they are in the process of providing alternative water sources to those wells. And that's also true of a singular well over here and a singular well over here where they had detections of PFAS, and they are providing them with alternative water sources. Coupeville at this point has not been evaluated for PFAS. It is not a regulated compound, so there is no thou shalt in coming at this point. But once Washington State does create its own regulation, then I expect very shortly thereafter we will see PFAS being evaluated. Going back to the biosolids discussion, PFAS is one of the compounds they are at the state and national level looking at in biosolids. It's fairly likely that they will be finding it when they start looking. And frankly, this is one of those things that we will be talking about long after I retire, because when you think about Stainmaster carpets and all of these other products, your raincoats and rain gear and all of those sorts of things, Teflon in your cookware also, it has PFAS in it. There are so many things that we have been using as consumers for the last 40 years that have these compounds in it. And if you steam clean your carpets and threw that water into your toilet and it went out into your drain field, odds are you have PFAS coming out of your drain field, and it's not going away. It's there and it's going to stay. We will probably find it around some of our fire departments around when we start looking, because they also use PFAS and they also trained with it, just like the federal government did. So we will be hearing about PFAS a lot in the future, and it will become something we will all become painfully aware of. Any other questions about that one? All right. Dewatering. So if you pull more water out of an aquifer than is recharging the aquifer, one of two things will happen. If it is, as many of our aquifers are connected to Puget Sound, i.e. the aquifer outcrops against the Puget Sound, in those aquifers, if you pull too much water out, you get seawater intrusion. The lack of balance in the water budget causes saltwater to move into the aquifer, and you get saltwater intrusion. But if you have perched aquifers that sit above sea level and you pull too hard out of those, you get what's known as dewatering or water mining, where water levels actually physically lower over time in the aquifers. And I have seen it happen once in this county. There is a perched aquifer on the north side of Camino Island that some large new developments 20 years ago tapped multiple wells into. And when they did, 10 years later, they started having problems with the wells, and they started measuring water levels, and they realized they had lost a lot of water level, and to the point where these wells were starting to pull air, suck air, and cavitate. And so what they did was that they they did some conservation measures, but B, they also drilled some new wells into different aquifers, and therefore some of has since recovered. So it tends to be something that can be managed if we know about it. And we have a pretty extensive monitoring network around the county that I monitor twice a year, trying to keep tabs on both things like seawater intrusion and dewatering and nitrates too. In the western United States, especially the arid desert southwest and west, they have been painting the deserts green with water pulled from deep aquifers over the years, and they have water levels dropping hundreds of feet in some of these large regional aquifers. And they are still dropping today, and at some point they will have to come to grips with that, because at some point water levels will fall far enough that one of two things happen. Either it becomes not economically feasible to try and pull the water from those great depths, or they will begin to bring up very highly saline water. Even in the center of the country, if you go deep enough, you get to highly saline water, and they will start to see essentially something like seawater intrusion occur, but in the middle of the country. So that's dewatering or water mining. And that's all I have to say about that one. Do you have any questions about that? All right, last topic is sea level rise. So climate change is on everybody's mind with the forest fires that are seemingly linked to that. But another effect of climate change is melting of polar ice caps, resulting in raising of sea level globally. And it is a concern, but interestingly enough for us, when you look at how our aquifer systems work, the water level in the Puget Sound surrounding our islands is what we would call a boundary condition. Essentially, all of the aquifers that abut against Puget Sound, sea level is a determining factor for the water levels in the aquifer, because they outcrop against that sea level, and their water levels, then that gradient that we see based on flow is tied to sea level. So if sea level rises, let's just say 5 feet, just pull a number out of the air, water levels in those aquifers will rise 5 feet in response to that rise in sea level. And so with the exception of some wells right along the shoreline that will need to be relocated, it really won't do anything substantial to the net amount of water available in the county. It will just move all of the water upward, and it'll move the interfaces upward in response to that rise in sea levels. But long term, the same amount of water, or very, very close to the same amount of water, will still be available to us. And that's all I had to say about that. And that is all I have. So I'd be happy to answer any random questions. Oh, the one contaminant I didn't talk about was total dissolved solids. And it's not one that I talk about much because it is a secondary MCL. So that means total dissolved solids is just that. It's how much stuff is dissolved in the water. And it has an MCL, but it's because of taste. It's just that when you end up with high total dissolved solids, typically associated, at least for us, with very, very hard water, it is not, it stains your fixtures, and some people don't like how it tastes. It causes your showers to get all frosty, but it's not a health concern unto itself. And so it's not something anybody regulates, other than if you're a group A water system and people get complaints, then they can force you to treat for hardness. But normally it's not something that we deal with on a regulatory basis, because it's simply an aesthetic issue. Questions?
I'm not.
Can I ask about the TDS then?
Good.
So basically, we were having problems with our well, and we had the well people come out, and we had to have a bunch of work done. And over time, the taste did start to change from what it used to be. It used to taste really good, and then it just wasn't tasting good. But anyway, so when they were working on our whole system, they tested the TDS, and basically we were at almost 1,000. And what we were told is that, and we looked it up and did some reading online, is that like 500 is the max. And when you start getting above that, it's actually really difficult for your body to process those solids over time. So that was the information that we were given, which of course then totally scared us. And we went and put an RO system in. I'm just wondering how, when you have that much solids, I mean, is it bad or is it not bad?
My understanding it is not, and that's why it is not considered a primary water drinking water standard. It's a secondary or aesthetic standard, meaning tastes, staining of fixtures, all of that sort of thing. It does not have a primary standard, so there's no associated health risk according to US EPA. So you must live somewhere in central Whidbey?
Yes.
Yeah, so we have some incredibly hard water in central Whidbey. Between Coopville and south of Oak Harbor, there's this area. Hardness is measured in the amount of calcium carbonate you would have to dissolve into the water to get that equivalent hardness. So it's called equivalent at calcium carbonate. And 0 to 60 is considered soft, 60 to 150 is considered hard, and greater than 150 is considered very hard. And we have 7 to 800s in the central Whidbey range. So chisel it out of the tap hard water, not unhealthy, but aesthetically problematic.
Interesting.
Other questions? Oh, so the other thing I was going to do, since I still have a couple minutes, see how this works. So I try and open up a browser and see if you can see that. How do I share that? Let me see, share the browser. Where's the browser? There, okay. So can you guys see my Google screen now? Great. So what I'm going to do is Google Island County Hydrogeology. And this is what you get. And if you click on the main link, you'll get to this page. And there's a few things I want to point out, but the first one are these two things here. News, Island County well data is now available via an online well viewer application. And if you hit that, it will take you out. And is this working? Are you guys seeing that? Yep. So you just hit the okay, and then you can zoom in and see all the wells that we know of in the county in any given area. The coloring of these icons has meaning, and there's a key to it right here. Essentially, there's a few different things being displayed. One of them is in the 4 quadrants around the circle, and it's giving you information about arsenic, chloride, nitrate, and water level elevations with high, medium, and low. So in the upper, and they're alphabetized. So if you start clockwise around, arsenic is in the upper right, then chloride's lower right, nitrates are lower left, and water level elevation. So if you look around and you see a lot of red triangles in the upper right corner, that means there's arsenic in exceedance of the MCL in those wells. Lower rights are chlorides, lower lefts are nitrates, and so you can real quick at a glance see what's going on in the area. The rest of the symbology has to do with how well we know where the well is located. If it's an open circle like this, it's based on township range, quarter section. We really don't know where that is. If it's got a X in it, like this one, we have it located to a parcel, but we don't really know where on the parcel it is. And if it has a smaller circle inside that, then we think we know right where it is on the parcel. So that gives you an idea of how well we know. If the circle, outer circle is this pinkish color versus black, that means it's affiliated with a public water system. And if it has a red box around it like this guy or this guy, that well has been abandoned and no longer exists. If you click on any given well, and I'm going to find one that I know has a bunch of data with it, like this guy. If you click on it, it'll give you some general information about it, but there's always going to be this more info link, and you can click that, and it takes you to our page for that well. And from there, you can pull it up in Google Maps or Google Earth. You can look at whatever other documents. You can look at the water well report for it, and you can come down here and look at water level data and all the water quality data we have. If you click this, it'll bring you to the water quality page for that well. And so this is the data we have. if you have a blue box around any of these columns, that means there's enough data to plot. If the columns are colored, that means if the column heads are colored, either red or green, that means we're seeing statistically significant trends in that component. If it's green, it's a declining trend. If it's red, it's a raising trend. All of these have time series plots associated with them, and you can click any one of them and pull up the time series plot for that. So you can dig pretty deep into the data that we have by going through that.
Doug, where's the link to the state DOH page on the wells? I think it's in there.
Well, if you went to one that is a public water system source, such as this guy. So if I click that, this is the City of Coopville's well 4-87. And if I go ahead and go to its info link, and then I scroll down to the public water system information section, it'll show you all of the sources, and you can go to any one of those sources by clicking on that. It also shows you the water system ID. That's the state's ID number. And if you click that, it will take you to the State Department of Health's website and give you information about that water system.
Great, that's what I was thinking of. And for those of you who use ICGeo to gather information on properties, you can get to this well data from ICGeo
Right.
just by going to
Right. I'll show you that
the
real
right
quick.
click.
Yeah. So ICGeo map is kind of a more, you know, the what I just showed you is specifically for well information. And so that's really all that's there. Oops, I did this wrong. I don't use this app very much. But down here in the lower left, there's a layers control. And if you come down to Health and DNR and you check that on and expand that folder, you can then turn on the wells layer. And then if you zoom in, you'll get the exact same information with the exact same capabilities. The difference is, well, not always, but sometimes if you click on something, the first thing it shows you is the parcel, but it has this little 1 of 2. And if I go to 2, it then takes me and highlights the well. And once again, I can jump out and get to that well's information. So that's there. And then the other one that I wanted to show you is this. And that is that there is this groundwater spatial analysis. The Well Viewer app is really good if you're just trying to find a well on the parcel and see what we know about it or see what wells are right around it. If you're trying to understand what's going on in an area from a groundwater perspective, this application is how to do that. And you hit this and it takes you to, oops, nope, wrong. Swing and a miss. This. So what you do here is you simply put in your name, you put in your email address, and then you zoom in on this map, and you can go like this to full screen the map. And you zoom in, or at least in theory, and you can pick a spot and click on it. And it then says, okay, I want to center my search on that. And then you pop out and if you've filled out your name and email address up here, you hit submit, and it then sends off to a computer here, which will generate a bunch of reports about what's going on from a groundwater perspective, including summary statistics on water quality, arsenic, nitrates, chlorides, all of that sort of thing. It gives you a bunch of information about stratigraphy and well depths and how deep you'd have to drill to get to different aquifers at that location.
How new is that tool?
About a year old.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Why we have to have you back every year.
Can you show again how you got there?
Sure. So if you Googled Island County hydrogeology, came to the main page, then you just simply click on this groundwater spatial analysis application, and it takes you there.
So cool, Doug.
Go real quick before I'm done with this. There's also a groundwater publications link here. And here I have compiled every report that's ever been written about groundwater in Island County. And then it kind of zooms out and looks bigger picture in not, you know, that pertain to Island County but are not specific to Island County. And then at the bottom, there's just a bunch of things I think people ought to know about. Things like earthquakes and landslides, emergency preparedness, arsenic in your drinking water. So this is a couple different sites. This is US EPA, this is State Department of Health. If you have arsenic in your well or one of your clients does, there's really good factual information. These are links. that take you to information about that sort of thing. Iron bacteria. A lot of people move here from areas where they just opened the tap and the water came out and now they own a well and they're like, well, what do I do? This is a free online class that tells you how to take care of your well. And there's some sheets here and information about owning your well, how to disinfect your well, how to measure water levels. And then there's a link to the variety of regulations that are related to groundwater in Loudoun County here. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just wondering how the report that you get in the email from the groundwater, is it pretty understandable to the layperson?
So
Or
let me show you one. And can you see my screen? Can you see my email?
no, you just shared your browser, so you'd have to go back and share.
Okay, so let me go here, new share, and I want to share my screen, share. So now can you see my email?
Yep, sure can.
Okay. So if I go down to here, these are all requests that have gone out. And so I'm just going to pull one up, and this is what you'll get. And so there is a series of 7 different documents that come, but along with them is one that's called 00 README, and that's just a document that explains what all the other ones mean. Do you have time? You want me to run through them real quick? Or
Yeah, show us. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the first one, so this is Senator, and I just randomly picked this one. I hope Dave King doesn't mind. So the first one just gives you a listing of wells. In this case, based on his location, it did a 3/4 mile search. It varies that search, it automatically varies that search radius based on how many wells. It wants to find a certain number, and it starts small and builds out until it gets a critical mass of wells. And so this is listed by distance. So here in this column, it tells you how far and in what direction from your search center are these wells. This is the well keys, and those same icons with the same icon strategy with, you know, the color coding corners are here, and these are links. And if you click on any one of those, it'll take you out to that wells page, which case you can dive down in and get into the water quality data and all of that. Then a variety of different parameters, and the bottom page of this is a key. So it'll give you a listing of what all these columns are and what they mean. Including here we have maximum chlorides, maximum nitrates, maximum arsenic, maximum hardness, well by well, but up here it gives you summary statistics for the search area. So the average chloride in this search was 18, the median was 11, and the max was 132. So you can tell a lot about what's going on from a water quality perspective in the area just by looking at this little section right here.
And those will be yellow and red if the levels are.
Yeah, so anything that's red here in the arsenic column that's maximum contaminant sample exceeded the standard. So that's that one. And the next one's just a map. So it's very much like what you saw before, but this is just a picture. So you can't interact with that. But the next one is a map that is Google Earth. And tell me if you can see Google Earth come up, can you? Yep, great. So Google Earth Map has the advantage, there's a couple advantages of the Google Earth Map. One is that it's interactive in that you can click on a well and get information about that well, and you can access that well's info page via this link. And you can zoom in and pan around. It has the parcel layer. Okay, so I have it automatically turned on. I should turn that off. But so there's also embedded in this, if you look over here on the left-hand side, this is the information that came via that map. And there's one called Public Layers, a folder. And if you expand that, there's all these things you can turn on, including the parcel layer. And you can turn it on and then have it in Google Earth. And if you click on it, once it loads, you can actually get information about the parcel. You can jump off to the assessor's information or SmartGov information about the parcel. So you can turn on a variety of different layers, public water system service areas, topo maps, all sorts of things that you can flick on top of Google Earth. So that's an interactive map. Then we have this, and this is perhaps the most powerful one in this set of documents. And what this is the frequency of distribution of the elevation of the bottom of the wells. And so when I look at this one, and every time you do one of these, it comes up with a totally different looking graph. This tells me that there really is only one aquifer that's being utilized in this area, and it occurs at an elevation between 25 feet and really 50 feet below sea level. So almost all the wells in the area are completed between 25 and 50 feet below sea level. The computer estimates based on the location you clicked, what is the elevation of that location. And so the right-hand, so left-hand is elevation, the left-hand vertical axis is elevation. The right-hand vertical axis is how deep would you have to drill at this location to get to that aquifer. So in this case, let me zoom in a little bit if I can. It looks like about, we're looking at 25-foot intervals. So right about 300-foot hole is what you'd need to get to this aquifer at this location where the person clicked when they submitted this.
I'm assuming well drillers are using this?
You know, well drillers have their own secret sauce. They all like to think that they have the best knowledge of what goes on. So there have been some well drillers that utilized it, but not very often. Most often they like to depend on their own intuition. This one is another one. This is a map of all the wells in that search area, but directly below and off to the right is giving you a look at the stratigraphy. So for every well on this map, there is a line here that is color-coded by what they drilled through as they went. And so the way to read this is blues are gravels, greens are sands, yellows are silts, and reds are clays and hard pans. And so you can squint your eyes and you can see there's a hodgepodge going. There's some clays in here, but there's a lot of sand and gravel out here. The little blue triangles, let me zoom in on this a little bit. The little blue triangles are water levels. This is elevation on this axis. So you can see how land surface is at the top of these wells as land surface. You can see how as you approach the shoreline, land surface elevation drops. But remember we said all the wells were completed between 25 and 50 feet below sea level. These little boxes are the well screens. And this is sea level and this is 50 feet. So here's where you can see all of these wells are completed in that same zone right through there. And the idea of here is that you can look east-west for trends in what's going on via this, and you can look north-south over here on this axis for what's going on in a north-south dimension. And this, so that's once again a static image. You can't interact with that one. This one is a Google Earth version of the same idea. And it does that. But this, you can actually look around, get down and walk through. And if you hover your mouse over any given section of a well, it'll tell you what they drilled through during that section of the well. You can click on it and get more information about what they drilled through, things like that. And the last one is this. It's a chloride versus electrical conductivity plot. It's a plot we use to diagnose whether elevated chlorides are caused by seawater intrusion or very hard water. If you had chlorides, let's say at 100 milligrams per liter, and it was due to hardness, it would plot over in this neck of the woods. If it was due to seawater intrusion, it would plot over here and along this line, depending on how bad. So this is just a diagnostic plot that we really commonly use looking at the source of chlorides.
Was that
So that's what you would
not
get.
in the seawater intrusion? Is that by
Yeah, no, this one is definitely not intruded. There's one, that one sample there looks like it might be an intruded sample, but everybody else, and this is looking at all the water quality data for all the wells in the search area. So there's a lot of water quality data there, and the vast majority of it looks just fine.
Yeah, as Dawn said in the comments, mind blown. I first heard Doug speak almost 15 years ago, and my mind was blown then. And I feel like I've heard you speak on this a half a dozen times. And every time I think, oh, I've heard everything. Like I won't, learn anything new by now. Every time, every time. Thank you, Doug.
You bet. Anybody else have questions while I'm here?
Doug, what causes sulfuric stinky water?
Hydrogen sulfide is that rotten egg smell, and it's sulfur-reducing bacteria. So it's bacteria that are eating the sulfur in the water, and a byproduct of that consumption is hydrogen sulfide gas. So it's oftentimes something that is growing in your water system. They like to grow in your hot water tank, sulfur-reducing bacteria. So if you mostly end up smelling it when you're running your hot water, then it might be that your hot water tank has sulfur bacteria. And quite often, if you do, you can bleach your system, shock chlorinate your system, and kill that off at least for some period of time. There are instructions on how to chlorinate your well here, right there. So it gives you directions on how to do that.
So sulfuric, so the rotten egg smell is something we do to the well, not something that's in the ground.
More often than not. It can exist in groundwater, but more often than not, we find it existing in the water system itself. Other questions? Oh, I know what I was going to do. So my PowerPoint, is it gone? Nope, it's still here. So the last slide of my PowerPoint is this one, which gives you my contact information, which I need to update. That's wrong. This will still work, but that's our old address. Our new address is now d.kelly@islandcountywa.gov. We've gotten away from this co.island.wa.us. It's islandcountywa.gov.
I have another question.
Uh-huh.
Are there wells that are spring-based, not aquifer-based on the island?
Yeah, most of them are old. So if you had a spring emanating from the side of a hill, a common practice, and this is a kind of turn of the century sort of thing, last century, would be to just do a drive point into the side of that hill so that you didn't have to have your water exposed to bugs and birds and all of that. And it would still be that spring water coming out, but you just drive like a 10-foot rod into the side of the hill and let the spring emanate from that so you could seal it off and get your water that way.
All right.
Doug, I want to address, Jen had written a comment with a concern that your kind of take on the MCS around total dissolved solids was different than what she heard from the well driller in Culligan. And my kind of assumption on it is that it's similar to, say, soda, right? We all know that there's plenty of people who say soda is not good for us, and yet there's not enough data out there for the government to say, we can't drink soda. It's kind of does that?
I honestly, and so you'd be best if you're really concerned to talk to your physician about it. You don't really want to get health advice from a geologist. But my take on it is it's really not unhealthy. I really don't think it is. And I actually asked my doctor once about this kind of in a reverse. I asked him, is it bad to drink deionized water, like distilled water or reverse osmosis water because it has no minerals in it? And he said, really, that the amount of minerals we're talking about compared to what you get through food ingestion is trivial. And so I think even with really hard water, the quantity of minerals you're bringing into your body is trivial by comparison to what you consume via food.
Great.
But like I said, don't take health advice from a geologist.
That's a good quote. I need to remember that. Very good. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and turn off the recording, and I've got to get to 2:30, and we had you for over an hour, so thank you so much, Doug. Really, really, really appreciate this, and I'm so glad I got this recorded because now it'll be required watching for new agents.
You guys have a great day. Stay safe.
Bye.